Just 3 reminders before we start the round. First of all, please make sure that all of your electronic devices are either turned off or on silent mode, and that list that you all as well. Have to make sure that none of it will ring in the middle of anyone's sentence. Second of all, please make sure that to the audience, when you guys are listening to our meeting, I know that's very important, but please try to keep it down to make sure that we will still be able to hear the speakers in the round. There. Give Prime Minister 2 reminders. So given all those things, on the motion, let's call on Prime Minister. Here you go. Tolerating the actions of the dictator Al-Assad. We think it's time for us to prosecute the crimes that he has done to their own civilians. And on that point, Mr. Madam Chair, I'm going to prove you 3 points. Firstly, why sovereignty is not an absolute artifact. And secondly, we're going to include ICC in this process. And I'm going to talk about why ICC is an effective measure of dealing with this kind of procedure. The third one, I'm going to tell you about why it has to be done now. My second speaker is going to talk about what kind of consequences this kind of trial can bring into international society relating to the actors, especially seeing the relationship between Turkey and Syria. Now let's move on to the first argument about why sovereignty is not an absolute concept. Madam Chair, we think of sovereignty as an historical artifact which came into place in modern state to represent the will of the people. So the state has sovereignty as long as it has the legitimate representative of the majority of the will of the people, Madam Chair. So we think that when the sovereignty of the state is not actually protecting the will of the people, it's not representing the will of the people, we think it doesn't have sovereignty anymore. And at that point, Madam Chair, international society has a responsibility to protect their own civilians, Madam Chair. And how do we know that? How do we know, thank you, international community, how do we know that civilians actually want international community to intervene in this form? We know it, well, thank you. And because we see uprisings happening inside this region, and we know that by picketing of the civilians go out Al-Assad. We think that these kinds of messages clearly show to the international community that civilians actually want some form of intervention inside their own community, Madam Chair. And we want that to be by trial. We think that thinking of the principle of the trial, thinking of the national sentiment of the civilians right now, thank you, how they are going against not just simply the dictatorship of Al-Assad, but actually wanting him to be punished of the past wrongdoings to their own civilians, such as torturing the opposition, such as killing the opposition groups in a very indiscriminatory manner, Madam Chair. We think that this also goes into the principle of trial, whether you punish that criminal no matter what, how the civilians think, or in this case, in accordance with how civilians think. So we think that in this case, Madam Chair, sovereignty is not absolute. And also we see how civilians want him to be punished. We think it is a legitimate case for the government to actually seek this kind of measure. No, criminal liability in any cases inside their own domestic region. And this is why the international community has to step in within the form of ICC. Do you think, Madam Chair, we're not now going to tell you why ICC is actually effective? No, thank you. We think that firstly, it has the institutional capacity. For example, we held ICC tribunals in former Yugoslavia, and it was very successful. Thank you. We prosecuted more than 200 criminals. No, thank you. And we think that this shows how institutional capacity is great in international criminal court. No, thank you. We also see, secondly, international criminal court historically has been working with these kinds of conflicts when aftermath of prosecuting these kinds of dictatorships. For example, Madam Chair, in the previous example of prosecuting Rose Kabuya from Rwanda, Madam Chair, due to the 1994 genocide, we see how these kinds of societies are turned in favor of democracy rather than going against those kinds of principles at the end of the day. No, thank you. And now thirdly, Madam Chair, we think that international criminal court is extremely effective in setting the international norms of jurisprudence. For example, in 1996, when International Criminal Tribunal, no, thank you, of Tanzania was actually in operation, they first classified rape as an act of genocide and prosecuted Rwanda. But we have these kinds of formal trials and tribunals to actually find the future actions of dictators. And we think that these kinds of effectiveness has been already shown in the international community, and therefore we want to use this kind of mechanism right now. And the ICC also has, Madam Chair, precedent of prosecuting the incumbent president or incumbent power. For example, ICC has the precedent of prosecuting Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, right? So we think that these kinds of institutional capacities are already proven in the status quo right now. So the third argument, Your Honor, the third argument that we're going to bring is why now question. We have firstly, Madam Chair, we think that seeing the trend of Arab Spring, we think that this is the right time for the international community to intervene. Because we don't know what kind of trend will come after this, Madam Chair. We think that this is the right timing, where most of the international community agrees that we have to intervene in some form of intervention in those areas. But secondly, Madam Chair, we think that is extremely difficult to do later because in later times we might not have political capital we need. For example, in the nations from Turkey, in the nations from participating in our league, Madam Chair. So we think that this has to be done right now with ICC, and we're very happy to
Madam Speaker, we believe a successful Prime Minister needs to contextualize the situation in the status quo and actually provide to the House in what situation Syria is actually in and what criteria Syria fits under the structure of the ICC, and then move on to explain to us why ICC is the way to go. Without having any relevant details about what exactly is going on in Syria, when exactly ICC will intervene, we have many questions to ask them, and we challenge the Deputy Prime Minister to bring up some answers in her own speech. But anyhow, so as the LO, the arguments that I want to provide to you today is basically, number one, that we believe that international intervention, especially in the form of establishing governments or dealing with heads of state, is quite dangerous and has imposing harms to domestically and internationally. Second, we think that it's setting a wrong precedent and it actually damages the function of ICC as a whole. But anyways, let's move on to rebuttals. First, now about contextualizing the situation. Now they tell us that, ICC has such criteria of crimes against humanity and genocide. Now first of all, we don't necessarily think what's happening in Syria is genocide. We think it's political conflicts. Now don't get me wrong, Madam Speaker, we're not going to condone what Al-Assad is doing. We're not saying he's a good guy. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to trial this evil man through the ICC, you need to prove to us that the will of the people, it no longer is a sovereign state. Madam Speaker, sovereign state is when that will of the people or that change within domestic power is left up to the domestic citizens. So an election for a new leader, trial of a new leader, or establishment of a new government, or continuation of an old government is ultimately up to the domestic power. Just because there's a dictator does not mean that state does not deserve sovereignty. So look up the dictionary, do you want? But anyways, moving on to this idea of ICC. Now, they tell us that, ICC was successful in Yugoslavia, that ICC was successful in Sudan. Madam Speaker, this is textbook international relations. Milosevic died before ICC reached any conclusion. Sudanese president actually danced in front of CNN because he was claimed without any punishment. So we asked them, give us a successful case of ICC intervention, because again, no successful cases whatsoever. So let's move on to the OO's case. Now, the OO's case is simple, Madam Speaker. We believe that when we're in a situation of political turmoil, when we have dictators actually assassinating or actually harming their opposition and not promoting democracy, number one, we don't really see as always democratic values preceding over any other value. But number two, when we see a domestic political turmoil, we ultimately believe that it's in the hands of the people to cause a grassroots revolution or to deal with aftermaths in the future. Because we believe that reconstruction and establishment of a new government ultimately and fundamentally comes from the power of the people, just like the values that they're promoting to you, Madam Speaker. It doesn't come from ICC, which, by the way, the United States, the superpower of the world, is not even a member of. But we tell you that ICC of foreign intervention does simply not work. Because again, they didn't really clarify to you whether it was, okay, we'll have NEAO intervene in Yugoslavia, and then what to do with Milosevic, ICC will do it, or that, there's a grassroots revolution, we'll just handpick the dictator out to trial in ICC. We don't understand where this ICC mechanism will ever come in. Because we tell you in the situation of Libya, of Tunisia, of all that Arabic Spring, we tell you that actually by the time that your leader is so frail that he or she is actually up to trial, that domestic infrastructure of his dictatorial rule is already broken down. Because they tell us, Al-Assad can't be tried domestically because his influence is so powerful. Fact of the matter is, the very fact that this leader is actually up for trial proves to you that his domestic rule is already fragile, that his entire institution is simply not available. The court that Al-Assad actually ruled over does not exist by the time that he is up for trial by anybody, Madam Speaker. So again, we don't really understand the fragility that they talk about domestic courts. Yes, woman.
Right, basically, since the institution does not exist in a domestic sense, we need to have a third-party intervention, making a legitimate justification for the people who are uprising against the dictator.
Number one, Madam Speaker, we see the benefit of having a trial, that punishment is deserved for a crime committed. But again, they need to prove to us that a third-party trial is the only way to go. Because we believe that assassination of a dictator, or toppling down a dictator, or reaching a negotiation of this dictator flying away to another country are all liable solutions that the domestic party or the domestic citizens can decide on their own. They need to prove to us that a third-party intervention is the only way to go, or the best way to go. Because simply put, we didn't hear any elaboration or explanation from you, and explain that right now.
So I told you in my argument that domestic courts will work only in favor of dictatorship, even if those kinds of court. Yeah.
Alright. Now, as to repeat a little, what the situation that they take is this. Al-Assad is still very powerful, and Al-Assad has huge influence over the court, therefore nothing will happen. The fact of the matter is, if people are not even bothering to topple down the Al-Assad government to begin with, then why bother? Because simply that's factually wrong. In Syria, we're seeing huge grassroots movements to topple down that regime, huge grassroots solutions and options that Syrians are trying to take in Damascus and in other cities of Syria. Because we simply say, leave it up to the people to deal with the leader in the way that they see fit, whether that be stoning, whether that be trial through domestic court, whatever way that it may be. Ultimately, what we're asking you is, why is a third party necessary, especially when you have to contextualize which situation this party will intervene? Are you militarily intervening and then dealing with the aftermath for ICC, or are you simply picking away a leader because you think it's evil? And that has even harder implications, which we don't elaborate in her speech. So ultimately, Madam Speaker, this debate's quite simple. We have a bad guy in the status quo doing bad things to his opposition or to people who want democracy. How do we deal with this? We deal with it the way that we deal with it in a way where democracy, the power of the people, is best represented. We leave it up to the people to deal with this leader in any way that they see fit. They need to prove to us that a third-party intervention is either, number one, necessary, or number two, the best way to go. Because we've already seen huge failures of NATO controlling Yugoslavia. We've seen huge failures of US trying to reconstruct Iraq on their own. We've seen huge failures across the continent, across the globe, of how a third party actually ruined it for that party facing a grassroots change. So ultimately, Madam Speaker, we're very proud to oppose this motion.
Okay, thank you for the floor. So while the height of Arab Spring Revolution is basically over, the fact is that people are still suffering in places like Syria every single day, simply because their dictator is not yet down and the dictatorship is not yet over. Al came up to tell us that there is no context that we have given you. Well, it was clear in PM speak that there is a context, but in case you weren't listening, let me tell you again. What happens in Syria now is that there are unsatisfied people who were unsatisfied simply because the revolution did not gain the outcome that they themselves want, the huge grassroots movement they themselves want, and secondly, a declining economy that is terribly bad for Syria. And I'm going to go into my rebuttals before moving on to consequences, both domestic and international, for Syria. First of all, on ICC, first of all, you talked about how ICC has no right to be giving this kind of trial because it's not genocide. Number one, you haven't shown us how you prove genocide. Genocide is a thing that's extremely difficult to do, even within courts, and you have no right to just come up and say here that, hey, this is not genocide, because people take years to prove that. Secondly, even if it's not genocide, it's also crimes against humanity, and that is something that ICC can trial, that you need to address. Secondly, you talked about how change needs to come from Syria organically, right? My PM has already shown you how there are movements, and you yourself consider that there are huge grassroots movements in Syria that want change. But however, because they are under a dictatorship, they can't have the change that they want. And this is why the international community need to step in with a proper legal framework through the ICC in order to step in and make this change and help them get through this change. And we think that that's an extremely good thing, right? Third of all, you talked about how the dictator is already fragile, essentially let them die off or something. Essentially, dictators are kind of like, the main character when they die in a movie. They take forever to die, sometimes not at all because they're going to die again. So what happens is that, first of all, we cannot assure that unless we trial it and put him to jail, we cannot assure that one day he wouldn't rise again. And secondly, even if we can, the principle here is on the trial. And we think that the trial is the most just and fair way to do things. And this is the way that a legal system in a democracy works. And we think that that's excellent. Last of all, you talked about alternatives, which was extremely shocking because you talked about what? Assassination and stoning, right? Like, oh my god, first of all, there is no legal framework within what you're talking about, and that leaves people pursue the kind of lawless measures and essentially do whatever they want. And this sets an extremely dangerous precedent as well, because we are now, you're now encouraging people to actually act outside of a legal framework, and we think that that's an extremely bad thing. Before I go on to my substantives, yes.
So are you saying that when Gaddafi was actually killed off by its domestic citizens, that solution was bad because there wasn't an international legal framework?
We think that him dead might be a good thing, but that way of going around things might not be the best way to do things because that is not exactly justified. And you haven't showed us how either. So now I'm going to move on to the two main consequences, right? In terms of domestic and in terms of international. Under domestic, we can look at two things, right? First of all, the people, the individuals, and secondly, the economy, both of which are equally important. If we look at the Syrian people, think about how they feel. Like, feelings are not something you want to discuss in the debate because it's a bit iffy. But after decades of oppression, you need a point where they can start their lives again. They need to be able to forget so that they can start their lives again. And we think that this is extremely important. And even if we do not concede that feelings are important in the debate because you want to be rational and everything, think about the supporters of dictators like this. When he is put on trial and thrown into jail, what happens is that people gain confidence in the new government, and that these supporters will fade away. They will scatter because there's no figure for them to rally around. And we think that that's an extremely good thing because then these bad influence will fade in the country, and we think that that's extremely important. Furthermore, with the overthrowing of this government, because trial because of all the bad things he did. He's gonna stay in jail for like a really, really long time. What happens is that you can get a new government and a new democracy. We think that as a new beginning is extremely important because it gains greater legitimacy, right? Because the new government now, based on elections, will have a greater responsibility and capacity for the responsibility to protect. And we think that that's extremely important given a population that's already been hurt so badly by dictators for over decades, and that is extremely important. Secondly, on the economy, the Syrian economy has been running for decades, even though it was not fantastic, but it's still been running along. But however, with the Arab Spring, what happens is that there was capital flight and investors have all fled the country. And according to a report in Foreign Policy, what happens is that this car seller, who's in the Damascus, he used to sell about 15 to 20 cars a day and a week, and now he sells 5 if he's lucky. What you see is that the hurt goes down to the common people as a result of this Arab Spring revolution. And we think that no, thank you. And we think that with the trial, it's a symbolic sign which will be able to rally in consumers and investor confidence, and this will help in kickstarting the economy, which is necessary, because if the economy does not kickstart, what you see essentially is a people with no leader, yet with no viable means of sustaining themselves, and this would eventually, in the long run, lead to all their suffering in the Arab Spring being completely useless, because a democracy can also not exist if there is no viable economic economy for them to sustain themselves. And so this is extremely important in order, as a symbol of change for investors to regain confidence in Syria as a destination for investments. Finally, on the point of international repercussions. So there are 2 points to this, right? First of all, the message is sent to other dictators of failing states, and secondly, to trade and diplomatic partners. First of all, to the message to other dictators of failing states. What they essentially see is that you get punished for the bad things you do. No matter what you are, whether you're an incumbent head of state, whatever kind of personnel you are, whatever kind of position you hold, if you do something that is against the will of other people and that harms other people, you pay for it. And this is a strong message that we want to send to other dictators who think that they can get away with just about everything that they want to do. Furthermore, as my partner has already talked about, the precedents that could be set by ICC will be extremely important in terms of setting a precedent for trying other sorts of dictators as well. You talked about there's no instance where ICC has succeeded, and I'll talk about that. Wrong. Because number one, you've got like Rwanda, and secondly, if you look at the Khmer Rouge trial in Cambodia, that has been a hugely successful trial case, and that has been going on for a while, and that it has been really effective in tackling all these people who have done wrong things, who have killed hundreds of people and thousands of people. I think that that's extremely important. Finally, on the idea of trade and diplomatic partners, what we show again is a reflection that real change is happening to Syria. It's not just a change in data, it's a real change, and that Syrian refugees in Turkey can go back to their country. Turkey and Syria can regain their ties because they are no longer burdened by the kind of tension that's involved. And we think that Syria's international relations all around, and for all these reasons, we are very proud to go.
Iraqi people fighting and not trusting the government. You see the failure of the new government in function in Iraq. You think it's totally not going to solve problems in Syria. On the second level, Madam Speaker, you think the economic idea, how it's undermining Syrian economy and will suddenly be good when we turn to ICC is totally doesn't make sense, because we think that it will lead to two scenarios. The first scenario of not working because we don't really see ICC making great changes within Syria, even if it does, because it's a third party, just arbitrarily removing a leader. We think it's going to be the same as Iraq, where a third party leads the job for the domestic ones. And even if it does work, we don't really see any guarantee the next leader who comes to the power will be suddenly democratic, or suddenly be over business and develop Syrian economy. So give us a reason or mechanism how it will work and how it will develop Syrian economy if suddenly Al-Assad is gone to ICC trial. And the third thing, Madam Speaker, we also think that ICC doesn't really send a positive message to the people by setting good examples, or to the dictators. We think it actually only has set bad examples how ICC is inefficient and ineffective in dealing with dictatorship, Madam Speaker. They talk about Rwanda, they talk about Cambodia. Madam Speaker, these things happened before ICC was established. So it wasn't really done through ICC to begin with. There was an international tribunal for separate tribunal for that. And we then prove the efficiency of ICC in solving the problem. We also think that ICC, the only case they built for this problem would be Yugoslavia military case, and you actually failed to prosecute the leader. You did prosecute it, but you failed to give a verdict for over 15 years. And how can you say that you are a legitimate and efficient actor, effective actor to solve the problem? And that leads me to the last point the opening government wants to talk about before the
Right. On what standard will you determine a certain kind of intervention is effective? Right? You get them to trial and punish them. Isn't that enough?
We think international intervention itself is bad. We think it should be done domestically, should be rooted domestically, and domestic people should be the main actor in striving for democracy, not international organization or third party arbitrarily intervening, saying that you need democracy, the leader is that we will do the job for you. And having that said, let's go into our point. We think it actually sets a bad precedent and opens the room for more abuse. We think the head of the state is actually very important. The reason why we don't randomly prosecute head of states, for instance, Kim Jong-il or Al-Assad, is because they mean something. They're not just random individuals. They represent the state system itself. And when you attack a prime minister or the head of the state, you're attacking the state itself. And we think that just giving the arbitrary standard, randomly attacking this head of state is problematic to begin with. And going into the ICC case, and we think it has these two scenarios. The first scenario is ICC not really drawing a desirable result. We think ICC itself is a highly political organization where it has Western values and standards to begin with. We think with those arbitrary standards that were drawn up by the Western states, you will apply the standards with your convenience and with your own interest. We think that Al-Assad should be indicted and should be dealt to ICC, but you see that these guys not being put into ICC because political interest of China, political interest of the United States, the political interest of Arab states is involved. And we think that when such political interest is involved, you either delay the procedure, let fairness is solve the problem. So we think whether it is positive, like
of international intervention, I believe consulted party of knowledge. They say Libya was a grassroots democratic movement. They say Iraq was a failure under international intervention. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to say Resolution 1973, Article 5, talking about no-fly zone in Libyan government, which when the rebellion never had any flight to begin with, was not an intervention. Tell me a way when the nations are taking an intervention, please. Second, they say Iraq was a failure case. Ladies and gentlemen, Iraq was an illegal intervention taken by the United States. As the United Nations Security Council has vetoed the resolution to intervene in Iraqi situation. And at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, there was a problem with the Iraqi case, is that the United States prosecuted Saddam Hussein and executed him, rather than having a neutral party here. What we are stating is that a neutral party like ICC can be an appropriate manner, an appropriate actor in dealing with the situation to go first and later on. But thank you. Before moving on to the case of the closing government, let me firstly go over the opening cases. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I think Julie will be a great job in setting how ICC will be an appropriate action. I will explain to you how ICC will actually do this situation. Ladies and gentlemen, before moving on, let's go over 5 points. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, they say grassroots movement is important in terms of cases like Syria. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when the government has tanks and missiles and guns and shooting it, you can't have a grassroots movement in this situation. The reason why the Libyan case was successful was that people gained confidence by the international intervention. And since in order for people to have a grassroots change in terms of the countries under an authoritarian region, they need the power from third-party intervention. So thank you. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what the alternative that the Archaeological representative is doing is that we should assassinate this person, we should kick him out of this country, we should try him under their own domestic court, ladies and gentlemen. You see, first of all, assassination is a legal measure. You want to go against the dictator because he's taking a legal measure, and you want to fight back to it by having a legal measure. What kind of logic is that? You want to fight legally to a legal person? Moving on to the second point, they stated that ICC is not an appropriate actor because it's not working properly, and they have been in serious cases where it's not working effectively. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please tell us why Syrian case will not be an appropriate case, and I will explain to you why Syria is an appropriate case. Third of all, ladies and gentlemen, they say sovereignty is an absolute factor which should not be intervened. But ladies and gentlemen, we've seen the case of the United Nations where they're saying having the economic sanctions, political sanctions, and at the same time allowing international intervention, like we have seen cases like Libya. Libya was a grassroots democratic change. That's the opening operations case. But ladies and gentlemen, since they have supported the case and stated that Libya was a successful case, we actually see that international intervention has justification for the violation. So thank you. Moving on to the fourth protocol, ladies and gentlemen. They stated that we don't have a standard in terms of when having international intervention. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the case that they have stated was that since there's a lot of political interest, blah 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 blah, therefore we cannot intervene in this situation. But ladies and gentlemen, even if we have political intervention and political influence within ICC, we have a specific standard. That is why they are stating that we can't intervene because it doesn't go under the standard that the ICC is working. In this situation, ladies and gentlemen, we will again explain to you why ICC. Nothing. Moving on to this point, they stated that democratic values should be held by these own people. Ladies and gentlemen, in order for democracy to work properly, ladies and gentlemen, we think we must have a certain kind of international recognition of the regime itself. In order for a regime to be recognized after Kureta, like we have seen in cases like South Africa, they must have international recognition, and in order to gain an international recognition, they have to have a legal instrument, a legal method, legal institution which recognizes the legal group. And therefore we say ICC will be an appropriate group, which we will also explain in our extension. Now let's move on to the extension. Why ICC and how is ICC? Yes, sir.
Because within nowadays, the international community, like USA, like the European Union, it actually have some economic sanctions towards these dictators. So I think the international attitudes actually change.
Well, I will explain to you why we should try to dictate. Now let's move on to the ICC. Ladies and gentlemen, cases and countries like Syria is highly concentrated on authoritarian figures and dictators. In this situation, trying a dictator is similar to a case in which we try the country itself. All the policies and international coordinations that this country is making is coming from the idea and approval of this dictator. And why ICC should persecute this person is very simple. We will divide into 3 different methods. First, we have violated the Geneva Convention, which prevents a certain kind of weapons proliferation. In this situation, ladies and gentlemen, when there is a violation of certain kind of law, ICC can interpret certain kind of treaty and say this kind of action is illegitimate. Second of all, there has been a violation of the individual's right due to the existence of torture, and this kind of cultures can be prosecuted within the situation because it's violating the humanitarian value that the international society is currently holding. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we have seen cases where the people have been killed within the street, and there was one of the justifications where the United Nations Security Council has justification to intervene with the sovereignty of that country and try to right? So in this situation, thank you. In this situation, we have clear justification in which we can try this individual. And how this trial can change the situation in Syria, let's get very simple. We're currently having a grassroots change within Syria, but it's not enough for the people. After we have people to throw away the government, the second thing that we have to think about is the aftermath. The study of democracy, preventing dictator from rising up again. However, in order for the government to do that, ladies and gentlemen, we need to have a certain kind of recognition. The reason why Libya is failing and the reason why Iraqi government is failing at this moment is that they haven't got an international recognition where everybody can agree in a mutual sense, although they might not be a perfect way. We're not here to give you a perfect solution to solve the issues regarding dictators within Syria. But what we want to do is to see the cases where they are violating international law under the name of dictator and under the name of their sovereignty. We should have an appropriate measure to make an improvement for the people that is living within their own society. The reason why we can't interpret this into a genocide is that they are basically killing every single one who are rising against the government, right? They have their own standard, which is very vague. If you won't go against the government, you are going to be killed under the name of genocide, which we want to interpret in that way. So seeing those cases, ladies and gentlemen, we see there is a humanitarian value which we uphold in this situation. And after trying this individual, although he may not get an appropriate, desirable, although he may not stay in jail forever and ever and ever, the appropriate desiring consequence that we are getting is that since there has been a trial which says, clearly state that this person was an illegitimate leader of the country, we can have with confidence within the rebellion groups that have rised up within Syrian territory. Since they have been rising up, recognized by the international community, their action and right action was legitimate, we can bring a stronger confidence in settling democracy within this region. What happens when democracy rebellion groups takes over the government is that there's going to be divided opinions who's going to be ruling this country. And since we have seen the cases that tyranny has failed and tried out of the international society, we think we have a justification to have that party over the perfect and take actions.
In this debate, it seems that both government side and opposition side actually realize there's a significant problem existing in Syria and other neighboring countries, and that's an action that we have to make in order to solve the crisis, solve the killing of civilians, or solve the killing of people. And the opposition side very actively propose a lot of alternatives why this actually more beneficial, is more effective, rather than trying for ICC. So eventually, the argument from those government sides to say, oh, well, ICC is a suitable organization to step in, will only stand if ICC is really that as effective as they claim. But I think that they have a very minor understanding of about the mechanics of ICC. First of all, are you really saying that by passing this kind of indictment, ICC can really go inside Syria and take away the person and bring it to court? It's very unlikely. Because the mechanics of ICC is, what we can see from examples of Zimbabwe, what we can see from example of Sudan. The problem is, if those countries that are not really a member of ICC, they do not really ratify the Rome Statute, there's no way for ICC to actually step in the country and take away the president and put them into court. And the second thing is about, because not all the members, not all the countries inside the society right now is actually a member of ICC. So there's no way for you to actually prove this kind of cooperation can actually take place in an inventory. And also we believe that this is only very slow effective because ICC does not even have a unit army force, meaning that what ICC relies on, even though the ICC actually passes prosecution, even ICC can actually, no thank you, ICC can actually issue some arrest warranty. But the problem is, they're still relying on the response from other countries, they're still relying on the response cooperation of other organizations, such as NATO and USA. That's why I believe that ICC is only symbolic in this debate, but it's not effective to take away Assad and to solve the problem inside Syria. No, thank you. That's the rebuttal about the mechanics of ICC. And also the second argument, second rebuttal to the Deputy Prime Minister. But she actually argued about the problem right now is about political chaos about the economy. But she's just assuming that even if we can actually take Al-Assad to the court, even if we can actually No, thank you. Even if we can actually try Al-Assad, that's the problem in Syria can solve immediately. But we don't think so. Because inside Syria, it's not only about, no, thank you. It's not only about one leader, it's not only about one person, but the problem is about the whole party, the whole forces that Al-Assad has established for more than 40 years. We believe that even though you can really try Al-Assad, you can actually guarantee significant movement inside Syria. Because the people, that is psychologically, the political figures, they still belong to Al-Assad, they still do whatever they have to do in order to continue his legacy, his faith. That's why I think that military intervention or other organizations such as Arab League will be a much more suitable role and much more suitable figure in order to intervene in this debate. No, thank you. And the matter of government, talk about why, if we do not have this kind of ICC as a legal organization established, therefore there will be no recognition of the new government. But we don't think so. We can actually see from examples of Egypt, we can see from the example of Libya, the interim government is actually being recognized by the society right now. They spend a lot of aid to those countries, and still people actually recognize them as a new government because it's a movement by power, it's a movement by people. They cannot actually compare this example to the example in Iran, because what's the situation in Iran is being invaded by America. But right now in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, it's actually a movement by people. So we think this kind of recognition will be very likely to happen, and we can actually see this recognition from the other part of the world very likely from the laws.
So are you saying that Libya actually made a grassroots change by himself without having any intervention whatsoever?
We see that why Libya can actually pass this conflict very in a short period of time is because they do not necessarily have to try the nation. Instead, they usually come military intervention. I believe that this kind of military intervention is more effective approach and it's actually justified. This is very not about to talk about the justification to this law. Thank you. So my extension about why we that this argument, this debate is actually how to actually give organic changes in those regions and how we should empower the people in order to make them, in order to let them give them more power to solve the problem by themselves. Which eventually that this is actually domestic topics that should not be interviewed by a third party as raised by the overall officer. But why do we see so? Because first of all, this kind of because we believe that the people inside Syria, people inside Libya and Egypt, they're the only people that really understand the culture and tradition inside the countries. And even though you say the culture is not a problem, but the problem is right now, the more suitable organizations really about Arab League, but not ICC. Because we believe that inside the Arab countries, what is the most legitimate organization is actually Arab League. Like what people they actively try to give more sanctions, they remove Syria as a member inside Arab League. This is why this kind of alternative action, which is actually more effective to give more pressure to Syria, to give more sanctions to them, just to say that you want to impose a very invisible policy, by taking him away to the court. And also we believe that it's also showing that the people, by empowering the people, we can actually show the zero tolerance towards this kind of violence actions, towards civilians and towards innocent people in the society. Because we believe that even if we actually invite ICC in this debate, first of all, I explained very clearly why it's actually effective because of the mechanism of ICC. There's no way for them to intervene, especially just to take him away. And the second thing is, these leaders, they always have a lot of reasons and excuses to escape from the indictment from ICC. Such are a lot of examples that we can see. Even if the ICC actually try to step in, but the problem is the leaders, they will not necessarily resign from the position. What we need is physical action, what is more pressure, what is more sanctions and recognition in order to force them to resign, in order to force them to step down and to negotiate with the people, but not just saying that you're going to put a very superficial leader, such as the ICC, to put him in.
So why is it organic change in trying outside in international criminal court? You choose exclusively this delay.
I'm saying that very clearly because it's invisible for you to just try Al-Assad without any physical pressure, without any physical pressure, without any physical threat. Because what you can say is that these arguments can only stand if you really can take Al-Assad into court, as I mentioned many times before. And the second is because why we believe that Arab League is actually more suitable organization, and why we believe that this kind of problem concerning about the Arab people should be dealt with an Arab organization, but not the ICC. First of all, it's about the ideology. We believe that ICC as an organization, they try to make us legal state. They cannot even, not all the countries in the society right now is actually member ICC. Secondly is, we cannot actually guarantee that ICC can actually take care of all the reference and all the attention of the Arab people. And there's no guarantee that ICC can actually bring the best government to these countries immediately, even if they can successfully try Al-Assad. But why Arab League? Because we believe that Arab League can actually understand more about the countries inside these regions, and also because Arab League has more power over Syria than ICC. Because what we are doing, such as UN, such as Arab League, what we can do is actually by giving this recognition, by giving Syria this kind of removal and membership, can actually bring them more fear, can actually bring them more pressure to force them to negotiate, to force them to sit on the table to talk to people. While just giving them this external force by the ICC, we do not think that it's actually effective. And second thing is, we do not think that this ICC can actually do a lot of things as raised by the other side. So based on what I told you, we back to our post.
Then second rebuttal, what they do. The actor of the region or whatever, or who's going to take a role. First of all, we are going to try these leaders of ICC because all the just pretenders to live nice